The risks and opportunities of leisure. It sounds somewhat ridiculous to say that one of the problems we face at this point in history is that we haven't learned how to spend free time in a sensible way. Yet this is a concern that many have expressed ever since the mid-century. In 1958, the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry ended its annual report with the conclusion, "For many Americans, leisure is dangerous." Others have claimed that whether America succeeds as a civilization will depend on the way we use free time. What could justify such grave warnings? But before answering this question about the effects of leisure on society, it makes sense to reflect on how a typical person is affected by leisure. The historical effects on this case are the sum of individual experiences. So in order to understand the former, it helps to understand the latter. For a variety of reasons discussed earlier, we have come to assume that free time is one of the most desirable goals we can aspire to. While work is seen as a necessary evil, being able to relax, to have nothing to do, seems to most people the royal road to happiness. The popular assumption is that no skills are involved in enjoying free time, and that anybody can do it. Yet the evidence suggests the opposite. Free time is more difficult to enjoy than work. Having leisure at one's disposal does not improve the quality of life unless one knows how to use it effectively, and it is by no means something one learns automatically. The psychoanalyst Sandor Ferenczi, at the turn of the century, already noticed that on Sundays his patients came down with bouts of hysteria and depression more often than during the rest of the week. He called the syndrome Sunday neurosis. Ever since, it has been reported that holidays and vacations are periods of increased mental disturbance. For workers who have identified with their jobs all their lives, retirement is often a transition to chronic depression. In our ESM studies, we find that even physical health is better when a person focuses on a goal. On weekends, when alone and with nothing to do, people report more symptoms of illness. All of this evidence points to the fact that the average person is ill-equipped to be idle. Without goals and without others to interact with, most people begin to lose motivation and concentration. The mind begins to wander, and more often than not, it will focus on unresolvable problems that cause anxiety. In order to avoid this undesirable condition, the person resorts to strategies that will ward off the worst of psychic entropy. Without necessarily being aware of it, one will seek out stimulation that will screen out the sources of anxiety from consciousness. This might be watching TV or reading redundant narratives, such as romances or mysteries, or engaging in obsessive gambling or promiscuous sexuality, or getting drunk and taking drugs. These are quick ways to reduce chaos in consciousness in the short run, but usually the only residue they leave behind is a feeling of listless dissatisfaction. Apparently, our nervous system has evolved to attend to external signals, but has not had time to adapt to long periods without obstacles and dangers. Few people have learned to structure their psychic energy autonomously, from the inside. In those successful societies where adults had time on their hands, elaborate cultural practices evolved to keep the mind busy. These included complex cycles of ceremonial rituals, dancing, and competitive tournaments that occasionally lasted for days and weeks on end, such as the Olympic Games that started toward the dawn of European history. Even if lacking religious or aesthetic activities, at least each village provided endless opportunities for gossip and discussion. Under the largest tree of the square, men not otherwise occupied sat smoking their pipes or chewing mildly hallucinogenic leaves and nuts, and kept their minds ordered through redundant conversation. This is still the pattern followed by men at leisure in the coffee shops of the Mediterranean or the beer halls of Northern Europe. Such methods of avoiding chaos in consciousness work to a certain extent, but they rarely contribute to a positive quality of experience. As we have seen earlier, human beings feel best in flow when they are fully involved in meeting a challenge, solving a problem, discovering something new. Most activities that produce flow also have clear goals, clear rules, immediate feedback, a set of external demands that focuses our attention and makes demands on our skills. Now, these are exactly the conditions that are most often lacking in free time. Of course, if one uses leisure to engage in a sport, an art form, or a hobby, then the requirements for flow will be present. But just free time with nothing specific to engage one's attention provides the opposite of flow, which is psychic entropy, where one feels listless and apathetic. Not all free time activities are the same. One major distinction is between active and passive leisure, which have quite different psychological effects. For example, U.S. teenagers experience flow, defined as high challenge and high skill moments, about 13% of the time that they spend watching television, 34% of the time they do hobbies, and 44% of the time they are involved in sports and games. This suggests that hobbies are about 2.5 times more likely to produce a state of heightened enjoyment than TV does, the active games and sports about 3 times more. Yet these same teenagers spend at least 4 times more of their free hours watching TV than doing hobbies or sports. Similar ratios are also true for adults. Why would we spend 4 times more time doing something that has less than half the chance of making us feel good? When we ask the participants of our studies this question, a consistent explanation begins to appear. The typical teenager admits that biking or playing basketball or playing the piano are more enjoyable than roaming through the mall or watching TV. But, they say, to get organized for a basketball game takes time. One has to change clothes and make arrangements. It takes at least half an hour of often dull practice each time one sits down at the piano before it begins to be fun. In other words, each of the flow-producing activities requires an initial investment of attention before it begins to be enjoyable. One needs such disposable activation energy to enjoy complex activities. If a person is too tired, anxious, or lacks the discipline to overcome the initial obstacle, he or she will have to settle for something that, although less enjoyable, is more accessible. This is where passive leisure activities come in. To just hang out with friends, read an unchallenging book, or turn on the TV set does not require much in the way of an upfront energy outlay. It doesn't demand skills or concentration. Thus, the consumption of passive leisure becomes all too often the option of choice, not only for adolescents, but for adults as well. When looking at our research, we can see a comparison of the major types of leisure activities in terms of how frequently they provide flow to a cross-section of American teenagers. We see that games and sports, hobbies and socializing, the 3 active and/or social activities, provide more flow experiences than the 3 more solitary and less structured activities, listening to music, thinking, and watching TV. At the same time, the activities that produce flow, being more demanding and difficult, also occasionally produce conditions of anxiety. The 3 passive leisure activities, on the other hand, seldom cause anxiety. Their contribution is to provide mainly relaxation and apathy. If you fill your leisure time with passive leisure, you won't find much enjoyment, but you will also avoid getting in over your head. Apparently, this is a bargain that many find worth making. It's not that relaxing is bad. Everyone needs to unwind, to read trashy novels, to sit on the couch staring at space or enjoying a TV program. As with the other ingredients of life, what matters is the dosage. Passive leisure becomes a problem when a person uses it as the principal or the only strategy to fill up free time. As these patterns turn into habits, they begin to have definite effects on the quality of life as a whole. Those who learn to rely on gambling to pass the time, for instance, may find themselves caught in a habit that interferes with their job, their family, and eventually with their own well-being. People who view television more often than the average tend also to have worse jobs and worse relationships. In a large-scale study in Germany, it was found that the more often people report reading books, the more flow experiences they claim to have, while the opposite trend was found for watching television. The most flow was reported by individuals who read a lot and watched little TV, the least by those who read seldom and watched often. Of course, such correlations don't necessarily mean that habits of passive leisure cause bad jobs, bad relationships, and so on. It is likely that the causal links start from the other end. Lonely people with dissatisfying jobs will fill their free time with passive leisure. Or those who cannot find flow otherwise in their lives turn to undemanding leisure activities. But in human development, causation is usually circular. What was an effect in the beginning eventually turns into a cause. An abusive parent may force his child to adopt a defense based on repressed aggression. As the child grows up, it is this style of defense, rather than the initial trauma, that might make it easy for him, in turn, to become an abusive parent. So adopting habits of passive leisure is not just an effect of previous problems, but becomes a cause in its own right, which cuts off further options for improving the quality of life. The phrase bread and circuses has become a commonplace to describe how the Roman Empire managed to keep the populace contented during the long centuries of its decline. By providing enough food to keep the bodies satisfied, and enough spectacles to keep the minds entertained, the ruling classes were able to avoid social unrest. It is unlikely that this policy was consciously adopted, but its widespread application seems to have worked. It would not have been either the first or the last time that providing leisure opportunities kept a community from unraveling. In the Persian Wars, the first historian of the West, the Greek Herodotus, describes how Attius, king of Lydia in Asia Minor, introduced ball games some 3,000 years ago as a way to distract his subjects when a series of bad crops caused unrest in the hungry population. The plan adopted against the famine was to engage in games one day so entirely as not to feel any cravings for food, he wrote, and the next day to eat and abstain from games. In this way they passed 18 years. A similar pattern developed in Constantinople during the waning of the Byzantine Empire. To keep the citizens happy, great chariot races were held in the city. The best drivers became rich and famous, and they were automatically elected to the Senate. In Central America, before the Spanish conquest, the Maya developed elaborate games similar to basketball, which kept spectators busy for weeks on end. In our times, disenfranchised minorities depend on sports and entertainment as avenues to social mobility. Basketball, baseball, boxing, and popular music absorb surplus psychic energy while promising wealth and fame. Depending on one's perspective, one can interpret this in two quite opposite ways. One can see in these instances leisure being used as an opiate of the masses, to paraphrase what Marx said about religion, or one can see them as creative responses to dangerous situations, impervious to more effective solutions. The record seems to suggest that a society begins to rely heavily on leisure, and especially on passive leisure, only when it has become incapable of offering meaningful, productive occupation to its members. Thus, bread and circuses is a ploy of last resort that postpones the dissolution of society only temporarily. Contemporary examples provide some insight into what happens in such instances. For example, many indigenous people in North America have lost the opportunity to experience flow in work and communal life, and seek to recapture it in leisure activities that mimic their earlier, enjoyable lifestyle. Young Navajo men used to feel at their best when riding after their sheep over the mesas of the Southwest, or in participating in week-long ceremonial singing and dancing. Now that such experiences are less relevant, they attempt to recapture flow by drinking alcohol and then racing down the desert highways in souped-up cars. The number of traffic fatalities may not be higher than those sustained earlier in tribal warfare or while shepherding, but they seem more pointless. The Inuit are going through a similar dangerous transition. Young people who can no longer experience the excitement of hunting seal and trapping bear turn to the automobile as a tool for escaping boredom and focusing on a purposeful goal. Apparently there are communities in the Arctic that have no roads connecting them to any other place, but have built miles of roads for the exclusive purpose of drag racing. In Saudi Arabia, the spoiled young scions of oil barons find riding camels passé and try to revive their interest by racing brand-new Cadillacs in the trackless desert or on the sidewalks of Riyadh. When productive activities become too routine and meaningless, leisure will pick up the slack. It will take up progressively more time and rely on increasingly more elaborate artificial stimulation. There are individuals who, confronted with the sterility of their jobs, escape productive responsibilities altogether to pursue a life of flow and leisure. This does not necessarily require a great deal of money. There are well-trained engineers who leave their jobs and wash dishes in restaurants during the winter so they can afford to do rock climbing all summer. There are colonies of surfers on the beaches with good waves who live hand-to-mouth so they can cram in as much flow as possible on their boards. An Australian social scientist, Jim Macbeth, interviewed dozens of ocean sailors who spend year after year navigating among the islands of the South Pacific, many of them owning nothing except the boat into which they've invested all their savings. When they run out of money for food or repairs, they stop at a port to do odd jobs until they can replenish their supplies. Then they cast off on the next journey. I was able to throw off responsibility, cast off a humdrum life, be a bit adventurous. I had to do something with life besides vegetate, says one of these modern Argonauts. It was a chance to do one really big thing in my life, big and memorable, says another. Or, in the words of another sailor, modern civilization has found radio, TV, nightclubs, and a huge variety of mechanized entertainment to titillate our senses and help us escape from the apparent boredom of the earth and the sun and wind and stars. Sailing returns these ancient realities. Some individuals do not abandon jobs altogether, but shift the emphasis from work to leisure as the center of their lives. One serious rock climber describes the exhilarating self-discipline of his sport as training for the rest of his life. He said, "If you win these battles enough, that battle against yourself, it becomes easier to win the battles in the world." And another former businessman, who moved to the mountains to be a carpenter, said, "I would have made a great deal of money in corporate life, but I realized one day that I wasn't enjoying it. I wasn't having the kind of experiences that make life rewarding. I saw that my priorities were mixed up, spending most of my hours in the office. The years were slipping by. I enjoy being a carpenter. I live where it's quiet and beautiful, and I climb most every night. I figure that my own relaxation and availability will mean more to my family than the material things I can no longer give them." The career move from businessman to carpenter is an example of the kind of creative readjustment that some people are able to bring to their lives. They search until they find a productive endeavor that also allows them to build as much flow as possible into their lives. The other options seem less satisfying. There is just too much one misses by becoming a workaholic or by escaping into leisure full time. Most of us, however, are content to compartmentalize our lives into boring jobs and routine entertainment. An interesting example of how flow seeps out of work and into leisure is provided in the study of an alpine community by Anatella Della Fave and Fausto Massimini of the University of Milan. They interviewed 46 members of an extended family in Pont Trentaz, a remote mountain village where people have cars and television sets, but still work at traditional tasks, such as herding cattle, growing orchards, and woodworking. The psychologists asked the 3 generations of villagers to describe when and how they experienced flow in their lives. The oldest generation reported the most frequent flow experiences, and the majority of them involved work, such as cutting hay in the meadows, fixing the barn, baking bread, milking cows, working in the garden. The middle generation, which included those between 40 and 60 years old, reported equal amounts of flow from work and from leisure activities, such as watching movies, going on vacations, reading books, or skiing. The grandchildren in the youngest generation showed a pattern opposite to that of their grandparents. They reported the fewest occurrences of flow, and most of it came from leisure. Dancing, motorcycle racing, and watching TV were some of the most frequent avenues of enjoyment. Not all of the generational differences in Pont Trentaz are due to social change. Some of it is a feature of normal developmental patterns that every generation passes through. Young people are always more dependent for enjoyment on artificial risk and stimulation. But it's almost certain that these normal differences are magnified in communities undergoing social and economic transition. In such cases, the older generations still find a meaningful challenge in traditional productive tasks, whereas their children and grandchildren, increasingly bored by what they see as irrelevant chores, turn to entertainment as a way of avoiding psychic entropy. In the United States, traditional communities like the Amish and the Mennonites have been able to keep work and flow from getting separated. In the everyday routines of their farming life, it's difficult to know when work stops and leisure begins. Most free-time activities, such as weaving, carpentry, singing, or reading, are useful and productive either in a material, social, or spiritual sense. Of course, this achievement has been at the price of remaining embalmed in amber, as it were, arrested at a point of technological and spiritual development that now seems quaint. Is this the only way to preserve the integrity of a joyful and productive existence? Or is it possible to reinvent a lifestyle that combines these traits within continuing evolutionary change? To make the best use of free time, one needs to devote as much ingenuity and attention to it as one would to one's job. Active leisure that helps a person grow does not come easy. In the past, leisure was justified because it gave people an opportunity to experiment and to develop skills. In fact, before science and the arts became professionalized, a great deal of scientific research, poetry, painting, and musical composition was carried out in a person's free time. Gregory Mendel did his famous genetic experiments as a hobby. Benjamin Franklin was led by interest, not a job description, to grind lenses and experiment with lightning rods. Emily Dickinson wrote her superb poetry to create order in her own life. Nowadays, only experts are supposed to be interested in such issues. Amateurs are derided for venturing into fields reserved for the specialist. But amateurs, those who do something because they love to do it, add enjoyment and interest to their own life and to everybody else's. It's not just extraordinary individuals who are able to make creative use of leisure. All folk art, the songs, the fabrics, the pottery and carvings that give each culture its particular identity and renown, is the result of common people striving to express their best skill in the time left free from work and maintenance chores. It is difficult to imagine how dull the world would be if our ancestors had used free time simply for passive entertainment, instead of finding it in an opportunity to explore beauty and knowledge. Currently, about 7% of all the non-renewable energy we use, electricity, gasoline, paper, and metal products, is being used primarily for leisure. Constructing and watering golf courses, printing magazines, flying jets to vacation resorts, producing and distributing TV shows, building and fueling powerboats and skidoos takes up a good deal of planetary resources. Ironically, it seems that how much happiness and enjoyment we get from leisure has no relation at all, if anything a negative relation, to the amount of material energy consumed while doing it. Low-key activities that require investments of skill, knowledge and emotions on our part, are just as rewarding as those that use up a lot of equipment and external energy, instead of our own psychic energy. Having a good conversation, gardening, reading poetry, volunteering in a hospital, or learning something new exhaust few resources and are at least as enjoyable as things that consume 10 times as many resources. Just as the excellence of an individual life depends, to a large extent, on how free time is used, so the quality of a society hinges on what its members do in their leisure time. Suburban communities can be so depressingly bland because one has reason to believe that behind the impressive facades rising from the emerald lawns, nobody is doing anything interesting. There are entire countries where one gets the impression from talking even with members of the societal elite that besides money, family, fashion, vacations, and gossip, there is not that much else that engages their attention. Whereas there are still some areas in the world where one finds retired professionals enchanted with classical poetry, who collect ancient volumes in their library, or farmers who play musical instruments or write down the stories of their village, preserving the best creations of their ancestors while adding to them. In any case, we have seen that at the social as well as the individual level, habits of leisure act as both effects and as causes. When the lifestyle of a social group becomes obsolete, when work turns into a boring routine and community responsibilities lose their meaning, it's likely that leisure will become increasingly important. And if a society becomes too dependent on entertainment, it is likely that there will be less psychic energy left to cope creatively with the technological and economic challenges that will inevitably arise. It may seem contrarian to raise alarms about the entertainment industry at a time when it is so successful in the U.S. Music, movies, fashion, and television bring in hard currency from all over the world. Video stores mushroom on practically every block, reducing the ranks of the unemployed. Our children look to media celebrities as models to steer their lives by, and our consciousness is filled with information about the doings of athletes and movie stars. How can all this success be harmful? If we assess trends only from the point of view of a financial bottom line, then there is nothing wrong. But if one counts also the long-term effects of generations addicted to passive entertainment, the rosy picture will look grim indeed. How to avoid the danger of polarizing life into work that is meaningless because it is unfree and leisure that is meaningless because it has no purpose? One possible way out is suggested by the example of the creative individuals discussed in the previous chapter. In their lives, work and play are indivisible, as they are for people living in traditional societies. But unlike the latter, creative persons have not retrenched into a frozen moment in time. They use the best knowledge from the past and the present to discover a better way of being in the future. To the extent that we can learn from them, there is no longer any reason to dread free time. Work itself becomes an enjoyable leisure, and when one needs a break from it, leisure is likely to be true recreation instead of a scheme for dulling the mind. If one's job is beyond redemption, the other solution is to make sure that free time, at least, will be a real opportunity for flow, for exploring the potential of the self and the environment. Luckily, the world is absolutely full of interesting things to do. Only lack of imagination or lack of energy stand in the way. Otherwise, each of us could be a poet or musician, an inventor or explorer, an amateur scholar, scientist, artist, or collector.